The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Reeves Brown, and we are welcoming you to the webinar series for Building a Better Colorado, Understanding Colorado's Gallagher Amendment. I want to welcome everybody here today and appreciate everybody joining us today. We are delighted to have the turnout. I think we have a couple hundred people that are joining us, and delighted to have our presenters, Joanne Groff and Larson Silbaugh, Joanne, State Property Tax Administrator, and Larson with the Colorado Office Legislative Council. So a little overview of how we're going to run this today. We've got a little bit of a slow connection here, so it takes just a second in between. So here's how the agenda is going to roll over the next hour for our working lunch. We're going to have a brief overview of how this works and talk about who is Building Better Colorado, introduce our presenters. We'll hear from Joanne Groff, then Larson Silbaugh, and then to the extent we have time, we will invite some Q&A. So the way that the webinar is going to work, you should all be able to hear, but you can't speak. We won't be able to hear you. As you think of any questions from our presenters as they're presenting, please feel free to type those questions in and send them in that questions tab, and Brian will be gathering those, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can. Our presenters, Joanne Groff. Joanne is the State Property Tax Administrator. Larson Silbaugh, the Principal Economist for the Colorado Legislative Council. So there is you'll find a survey when we conclude this webinar, and we ask that you just take about 60 seconds to respond to that and let us know what you thought of the webinar and how we might be able to improve it for the future. So we have a couple of questions that we wanted to ask of you, and I'm keep looking over to Brian's screen to see if that launches. You should have a poll on your screen. Where are you participating from today? I would ask you to select one of those options, whether you're from the Denver metro area, non-Denver Front Range, Western Slope, Eastern Plains, or out of state. And it looks like we have about 129 people participating today. Okay, I'm going to close that poll and share those results. I keep looking over at Brian's screen to see if it's popping up. And again, we have a bit of a slow connection. So as you can see on your screen there, about 38%, 40% of our participants are from the Denver metro area, 25% Front Range non-Denver, 29% Western Slope, 9% Eastern. So, okay. So we're going to go to our next question here. What is your age range? And if you could respond to that. We don't do anything with this information other than gives us an idea who's joining us today, and gives you an idea as well where people are coming from and a little bit about them. I'm going to close this in 10 seconds. Okay. Close that, share those results. So it looks like about a third of our participants are over 60, about a third are 51 to 60, and about 20% each 41 to 50 or 31 to 40. Only 3% under the age of 30. Okay. What is your profession? Student, business, nonprofit, government, or retired? Share that. Looks like about half are government in some form at some level, 20% retired, 17% nonprofit, 15% business, and a student. Okay. And finally, our last question, what is your political leaning? Strongly left, center, slightly right, strongly right. So 30% identify as center, 20% slight right, 8% strong right, 25% slight left, 17% strong left. So pretty good balance across the spectrum. Brian, if we could bring Joanne up and let her present and share her slides.
Fabulous. So what a pleasure to be able to participate in this. At my age, I fall into that over 60 category now. At my age, I don't have that many brand new experiences. This is one of them.
A little closer, no, a little the other way. There,
This
so
way,
we can
this
see
way.
centered. There you go, right there.
All right. So you can see me. All right. So with no further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I start this presentation always with property tax in the state of Colorado. And I think this is really important. Several of you may already know it, but all property tax in the state of Colorado starts with real value, actual value. What is the value of the property that we are talking about? And then we socialize that value by assigning an assessment rate. For residential right now, it's at 7.2. That's the whole Gallagher conversation we're going to have. For most non-residential, we're at 29. And then for oil and gas and extracted minerals, we're at 87.5%. Don't feel too badly for them. They get other considerations. So we then take that assessed value, kind of the assessed value soup, and against that assessed value for each local district, they assign a mill levy, and that equals what taxes you owe. So again, looking at that assessment rate, that's a big part of what you ultimately owe from your tax standpoint. So a lot of people refer to Gallagher. Gallagher was actually an amendment, Constitutional Amendment 1, which was a referendum carried by the Senate and the House and referred to the ballot in 1982. It passed by 65%, very embraced by a number of groups. It came from a working group that had been started by then Speaker of the House, Bev Bledsoe. That working group had assessors, it had business leaders, it had agricultural folks on it, it had a representative of real people or two, but the Gallagher Amendment came along because the Senate Democrats were concerned that not enough was in this amendment that paid attention to real people. So what did it do other than the assessment rate for residential property? Well, it exempted certain personal property. You all might remember hearing stories about TVs being taken across the county when the assessor came in. Well, you didn't have to do that anymore. You didn't have to do that anymore already in Colorado, but now they put it in the Constitution. They also eliminated inventory tax. They eliminated tax on agricultural products. There were a number of taxes that had fallen into that personal property standpoint that they eliminated. They did not eliminate personal property used for business gain, or what has been shorthanded now to business personal property. They established the annual assessment audit, and to me this is probably the most important thing that this amendment did, because the annual assessment audit goes out, it is hired by legislative council on behalf of the legislature, and that group goes out and audits your assessors every year to determine that they are staying within certain parameters of value. So they can't get away with manipulating values the way they might have been able to. I'm sure none of them did before that time. It reconstituted the State Board of Equalization to the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House, Governor, and 2 members appointed by the Governor. And I care about that because it put the property tax administrator position into the Constitution and hired by that very State Board of Equalization. And what we always shorthand it to is it contained the Gallagher Amendment. Now, the Gallagher Amendment created a floating residential assessment rate to maintain a somewhat fixed relationship between that assessed pool contribution from residential property versus all other classes of property. It's often referred to as the 45-55 split. It has never been exactly 45-55, but that's good for, I have a colleague that would hate me saying this, but that's good for government work. So that 45-55 split, why? Well, in the late 50s, residential property contributed about 25% to the total assessment pool. By 1982, it was contributing almost 50%. And it was that relationship that Dennis Gallagher, who was a senator at the time, and his friends in the Senate wanted to ensconce into the Constitution. So how did they do it? There's certain language, and this is the language that's in the Article 10, Section 3B, and it talks about the responsibilities of the General Assembly. And I'm going to go back to that a few times during my speech because it is ultimately the General Assembly that gets to set the residential assessment rate. And this says how they're going to do it. They're going to determine the percentage of the aggregate statewide valuation for assessment, which is attributable to each class of property. As they do that, then the General Assembly shall adjust the ratio of valuation for assessment for residential, only residential, to ensure that that contribution from residential property stays at approximately the same as it was the previous year. There are two steps that we do it. We establish what is the residential target percentage, and then we look to estimates from your county assessors to tell us what they think are happening in the real world of the new reassessment cycle. And we then base the residential assessment rate recommendation on their recommendation. So who does the study? This is a question that came up 2 years ago. The statutes require the property tax administrator and the Division of Property Taxation to do the study. However, the legislature also says that the residential rate shall be based on a documented estimate of the total valuation. So the legislature does not tie themselves into using my study. They just tie me into doing it. So I can't talk about the Gallagher Amendment, that part of the residential assessment rate that's determined by the Constitution, without talking about its interplay with Tabor. This is not a Tabor presentation, and frankly, this is about all I know about Tabor. In Tabor, there is language that requires an election. And many of you have heard over the years that election, if there is a tax policy change that is directly causing a net tax revenue gain. Well, there's another sentence in there a little bit earlier on that we care about, and that is valuation for assessment ratio increase for a property tax. Now go back to the original constitutional language that we talked about with Gallagher, and what assessment ratio changes? Only one, the residential assessment rate. So it is clear to most that this language of Tabor was meant to inhibit the ability of the residential assessment rate to go up. So here are the residential assessment rates enacted and recommendations from us during the tenure of the Gallagher Amendment since 1983 when this passed. We started at 21%. And we fell below 21% for the first time in 1997. And you'll see that when we fell below in 1997, the date of the Tabor Amendment was 1992. So when the Gallagher rate fell below 10, when the residential assessment rate fell below 10, it was during the time of the Tabor Amendment. So what happened in 1999? Well, in 1999, our study said residential assessment rate should go up. And the legislature chose not to take that to the people and instead leave it at the 974 that they had established for the previous assessment section. One often has to wonder if the legislature had taken it upon themselves to put it on the ballot at that time and ask for the residential, for the increase, would they have gotten it? Or would the taxpayers have said no? It doesn't matter. It's an academic question because they never did it. So we went on along until 2003. And in 2003, the study said, the two studies, we had now gone to the point where we're doing two studies, one in January as the statute requires, and one in April, around April 15th. The reason we do one on April 15th is that we're a lot closer to the actual values that the assessors are going to be sending out. So we wanted to get this as accurate as possible. The legislature wanted to get it as accurate as possible. And so we do that second study, and often it's the information from that second study that is more prevalent in the setting of the residential assessment rate. But in this particular year, you'll see The primary study, the preliminary study, said 8.18, and the second study said 8.04. But there was a problem. There was a large county. Any of you in Jefferson County, I pick on them by name every time I make this presentation. But Jefferson County had not completed their reappraisal at that time, and they asked for extra time. The legislature granted it. When they came in with their preliminary numbers, those numbers that they were getting ready to send out on notices of value, it drove the residential assessment rate down to 796, and that's what the legislature adopted for that year. And go back to that Tabor question, that's where the legislature chose to stay every year after that for 7 reassessment cycles, 14 years. There's a lot of conversation that happens around why wasn't anybody paying attention to this? Well, we were paying attention to it every 2 years. Legislative Council was paying attention to it every 2 years, and the legislature was introducing a bill every 2 years. But when the residential assessment rate stayed at 796 for 14 years, that's kind of a lifetime in the tenure of elected officials these days. And so when it came down 2 years ago to having the residential assessment rate drop below the 796, it took people by surprise. So why do we have this issue? Why is it dropping so low? This is my favorite slide in all of the slides you're going to see. And it shows you that the actual value of residential property in the state of Colorado has grown. In 2017, it was almost 80% of the total value of the state. 79.8% of the total value. 20.2% is all other value. That's oil and gas value. That's agriculture value. That's downtown Denver commercial building value. All other value in the state adds up to 20%, and residential value is at 80%. So this is what's happened with the value trends. You'll see that they've gone up over time. It has definitely increased this value. That value that is accessible to taxing jurisdictions for their tax assessed value has grown. But where it has grown is the residential still continues to contribute at approximately 45%, and the all other contribute at the 55%.
So I wanted to just take a second and talk about Building a Better Colorado, and more specifically about the page on our website that you're looking at that deals with the Gallagher Amendment, because we will, at their permission, Larsa and Joanne have invited us to share their presentations. And so what you're seeing here today, the slides, the audio, all of that will be posted to the website, and you'll all be able to see that. But in addition to that, there's information, additional information, which some of you, maybe all of you, have seen on the website itself. And I just kind of want to walk through that. First of all, just Building Better Colorado, we're a nonpartisan organization. Our mission is just to engage Coloradans in an intelligent, fact-based conversation about state public policy and how we might improve that. We were started in 2015. We hosted 30 meetings around the state, engaged about 10,000 Coloradans in conversations in those community meetings and online, arrived at 5 consensus policy recommendations regarding the election system, the initiative process, and fiscal policy. 3 of those 5 recommendations went to the ballot in 2016 from separate independent campaigns, were all adopted by the Coloradans. Legislature adopted a 4th recommendation, and we are continuing that process, an ongoing conversation about how we might achieve better, more sustainable state fiscal policy. And we'll be out in the field next year in 2019 in 37 communities hosting those meetings. So, Building Better Colorado, again, is nonpartisan. We are non-advocacy in our conversations. We're not advocating for any specific solution or to any specific problem. On the About tab, you can see who our executive committee is. It's a politically balanced executive committee. As you can see there, the Colorado demographic versus the demographic of BBCO's executive committee, and that is very deliberate. If you would like to get involved in Building Better Colorado and be considered for participating in one of the meetings next year in 2019 in 37 communities around the state, you can just click that Participate tab and enter your name and information there. The only other thing I want to show you here on the website was on this Issues tab up above. And in that Issues tab, when you scroll down a little bit, you'll see a couple of highlighted links here where we have fairly extensive information on both how the state budget works and what we're talking about today, what is the Gallagher Amendment. And if you go to that page on the Gallagher Amendment, everything that Joanne just covered, you'll see in some form or fashion on this page. We have a couple of testimonials here from fire departments in Montrose and Elizabeth talking about how the Gallagher Amendment specifically affects them. There's a page here to explain how the property tax calculation works with mill levy and the assessment rate. Short video about the Gallagher Amendment. What I wanted to point you to more, two areas most important is how Gallagher affects our property taxes, and there's bars here that cover everything that that Joanne went through in a different form or fashion. So we encourage you to go through there. It talks about the 6 ways it impacts Colorado, and then another set of bars that talks about how Gallagher has affected Colorado, and you can see that chart there that talks about the declining residential assessment rate over time, which is now at 7.2. With that, we're going to turn over to Larson. I'll let Brian turn over the controls to Larson and his screen, and we'll hear from him.
One of my primary responsibilities is to forecast state tax revenue that impacts the budget. And once a year, we do a revenue forecast every quarter. And then once a year, we estimate the residential assessment rate, which is an input for school finances. So last December, in December of 2017, we estimated that the residential assessment rate for 2019 and 2020 would be 6.11%. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that forecast, that estimate. I'm going to talk about how that estimate impacts the school finance portion of the state budget, talk about the impact on local districts, and then talk about some bills that are in front of a committee looking at the Gallagher Amendment. So first, to talk about my forecast, we look at what's going on in the economy. This forecast was produced in December of 2017, so the forecast is consistent with those economic conditions. So we tried to estimate how much residential actual values would increase. We tried to estimate how much actual non-residential values would increase. We do it by school district and then aggregate it up for the state. And that's how we produced our forecast. So this graph shows a little stair-step pattern for residential properties. Residential properties are assessed every 2 years. So in June of 2019, January 1, 2019, the actual value of the property will be the value of that property on June 30th, 2018. And the increase, that stair step, will be the 2-year change from June 30th, 2016. So you have a nice stair step pattern, and that's the trigger for, so that's for residential property. For non-residential property, you have some annually assessed values. In addition, most commercial and industrial property is valued every 2 years or reassessed every 2 years. And so you have a stair step pattern in non-residential values as well. So this graph, or our forecast, shows an annual average appreciation for non-residential property of 2.3% and annual residential growth of 8.6%. And so from Joanne's presentation, if residential property grows faster than non-residential property, you're going to have a reduction in the residential assessment rate. So to go through the details a little bit more, that rate, the increase in residential properties, if you didn't change the residential assessment rate, would result in a proportional increase in residential assessed values. However, that would cause the residential properties to exceed the target percentage as required by the Constitution. So the vehicle for maintaining the target percentage is a reduction in the residential assessment rate or a change in the residential assessment rate. In this case, since the residential values exceed the target percentage, it causes a reduction in the residential assessment rate to 6.11. So this forecast is consistent with the economic conditions that we were seeing in 2000, a year ago. There's a bunch of assumptions built into it. So we have increases in market value for residential property. We have increases in market value or actual value for non-residential property. That includes commercial buildings, industrial buildings. It includes growth in the oil and gas sector, other natural resource properties. It includes state assessed utilities, the agricultural prices for agricultural land, prices of vacant land. So there's a lot of background that's going into this to create that 6.11% assessment rate. That's just to say that we do have a 9.5% reduction in the residential assessment rate we have a 15% reduction in the residential assessment rate from 7.2% to 6.11%. But that obviously doesn't result in a 15% reduction in the residential assessed value. That's because you're adding the actual value in the home price appreciation from the previous 2 years. You also have growth in those non-residential values, which leads to an overall increase in the tax base of 3.8% in 2019 and 2.0% in 2020. So while the Gallagher Amendment does reduce the residential assessment rate, it's more complicated when you're looking at the total tax base, or as Joanne referred to it as the soup of all the property in the state. So where did this forecast come from? A lot of it is coming from the growth in home prices. So this graph shows the home price index from the Federal Housing Finance Agency for the metro areas in the state. So you have Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, and Greeley. The Northern Front Range has seen extremely robust home price appreciation and housing growth and growth in housing prices over the last 2 years. And so this is reflected in the increase in actual values in the state. But it's disproportionate. So you have Boulder, the fastest growing metro area in the state, and then Pueblo and Grand Junction, who are farther behind. So all of this is going into our forecast so that we can estimate statewide valuation for assessment. The Gallagher Amendment is all about the state or the statewide tax base and doesn't look at regional impacts. But since you have the largest housing markets in the state, in Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Greeley, that are growing faster than the rest of the state, that's what's driving the increase in the residential market values and therefore the decrease in the residential assessment rate. So why do we care about this as a state? That's the principal job that I have is forecasting revenues into the general fund and other sources of revenue, and then trying to estimate what that impact is on the budget. So on the left-hand side is a graph showing our revenue sources in fiscal year 17-18 into the general fund. So individual income taxes, 63%, corporate income taxes, 5%, sales and use taxes, 27%. This is money into the general fund that the General Assembly may spend for all sorts of government services. Now, I want to point out that there is no statewide property tax. So while the state sets the residential assessment rates, property taxes don't directly impact state tax revenue. So why do we care about assessed values? Well, we care about assessed values because they are one component of K-12 education. K-12 education is the largest single line item in the state budget, using almost $4.5 billion in general fund revenue, about 40% of the general fund expenditures. And how the School Finance Act works in Colorado is the state says, you're going to have per pupil revenue. You're going to get a certain amount per pupil, and that's what you get to fund education. Now, I'm not an expert in property taxes. I just have the basics enough to get into trouble, but this is my understanding of how it works. So the General Assembly says, here's how much revenue you get per pupil, and that's going to be supported by the local share, and then the state share is going to backfill the rest. So the local share is predominantly property taxes. You have some vehicle registration fees in there as well. But the local school districts take their tax base, apply the mills, and that generates a portion of property taxes. So in some districts, if you look at Pitkin County or in Aspen, they have a large enough tax base and a small enough number of pupils that they can fully fund funding. With some districts, Aspen or Pitkin, have a large enough tax base and few enough students that they're able to fund their per pupil funding with the tax base and with their mills. So there's no backfill from the state. For other districts, they collect whatever property tax they can based on their tax base and their mills, and then the state backfills the rest. And over time, that aggregate state share has increased from 43% in 1987-88 up to 64% in fiscal year 17-18. And that's corresponded with a reduction in the local share. Now, this isn't all because of the Gallagher Amendment. There's complications in the school finance formula and what's going on, but you have the Gallagher Amendment, you have Tabor Amendment 23, which increased per pupil funding over a base amount, and then you had a mill levy freeze, which is state tax policy in 2007. But this is all to say that as the residential assessment rate declines and the statewide average mill levy declines, it puts pressure on the state budget. So that's why we forecast assessed values once a year, and one component of that is the residential assessment rate. I've talked about school finances, and school finances are about school property taxes are about 50% of total property taxes collected in the state. So you're probably asking, what about everyone else? So this is cities, counties, special districts. In special districts, there's 20 protection districts, water conservation districts, mosquito districts, essentially districts that are providing a service to a group of properties, and they collect, it's based on the tax base in that district and whatever mills they can collect. So this map shows the change in the residential assessed values by county between 2016 and 2017. So this is essentially what happened to the tax base the last reassessment cycle, when you had new value added on and then a rate reduction from 7.96 to 7.2. And as you can see, the growth is occurring in the Northern Front Range, north of Denver, Fort Collins, Greeley, Boulder, and the Denver metro area. And so those areas where you had more than, you had enough growth. So the rate reduction from 7.96 to 7.2 was 9.5%. So if you had more than 9.5% appreciation in home values over a 2-year period, you're going to have a positive change in your residential tax base. And in Fort Collins, Boulder, Denver, you had much more than 9.5%, which led to an increase in your residential tax base. But in other areas of the state, you didn't have as much robust growth as you did in the Northern Front Range, which impacted the residential tax base across the state. So there are 29 counties on this map that had a decline, an actual decline in their residential assessment values. So the residential tax base between 2016 and 2017. So for fire districts, for mosquito districts, that's their tax base. So if their tax base declines between 16 and 17 and they don't raise mills, their revenue will decline. So that will, so that's one portion of the tax base. That's the residential assessed values. The other portion is everything else. And when you add in the total tax base, it's not as dramatic. It's not 29 counties that had a decrease. It is instead 18 counties. But the pattern is generally the same. Where you have growth along the Northern Front Range, Weld County is a little bit of an outlier because you had a reduction in oil and gas values between 16 and 17. But generally, it's the rural areas of the state that have declines in their tax base. And this is either going to reduce, so those local governments in those areas of the state have a decision to make. They can either go to voters and ask to raise their mills, or they can reduce services. But this is sort of the distributional impacts, where Gallagher Amendment is all about the statewide assessment rates and the statewide assessed value, but property taxes are collected at the local level, and there's no statewide tax, property tax. So that's a little bit about our forecast, where the 6.11% came from. That's about school finance and how the pressures on the general fund budget. And the impact very, very generally on what happens to special districts. One thing I did want to add in terms of those other districts, not schools, but everyone else who gets property tax revenue, you have cities, counties, and special districts. So in terms of public finances, most revenue for cities comes from sales taxes, and then it's supplemented by the property tax. For counties, most revenue comes from property taxes, and then it's supplemented by sales and use taxes. But for special districts, we're talking about fire protection districts, mosquito districts, water conservation districts, library districts, these other districts that are providing services to a group of properties or to a region, their sole revenue generating mechanism is property taxes. And so without raising mills, if you have the Northern Front Range driving a reduction in the residential assessment rate, it has impacts throughout the state on these local services. So because of this phenomenon, at least one portion of this committee, so the General Assembly created an interim committee to look at alternatives to the Gallagher Amendment. And at least part of the reason why they created this is because of this phenomenon where you had Northern Front Range growth driving down residential assessment rates statewide. And so this committee was formed. They've been meeting all summer. And in the last meeting, they had 7 bills drafted. So I want to make clear these aren't committee recommendations. No members have taken a position on them, but they were drafted and they are open for discussion. So I'll run through those 7 bill topics quickly, just so that you know they're out there, and then I'll wrap up my presentation. So the first bill is to repeal the Gallagher Amendment, to take it out of the Constitution. So this would require a vote of the people in 2019 or 2020. That's one of the possibilities for the committee is going to consider. A statutory change would be to reclassify short-term rental units from residential property to non-residential property. So right now, VRBOs, Airbnbs, those types of properties that are residential, they're homes, and are rented out on a short-term basis, they're taxed as residential property and they're assessed at 7.20%. Hotels and motels are assessed as 29%. And so this would reclassify short-term rentals and treat them as hotels or motels, or for VRBO as bed and breakfasts if the entire property isn't rented out. So this would be a change in the classification, which would have an impact on the assessment rate. The impact on this is all over. It depends on how many rental properties or short-term rentals you have in your county or in your local district. So a resort area that has a lot of second homes or short-term rentals would see a decent increase in their tax base because of this change and this reclassification. Other counties that don't have as many short-term rentals, they wouldn't see much of a benefit from the classification. One other complication from this bill is classification. So in addition to having an increased tax base because of the reclassification from residential to non-residential, it would also have an impact on the residential assessment rate. So this is complicated, so I'll try to explain it as clearly as possible. But without change, this wouldn't change the target percentage that Joanne calculates and the Division of Property Taxation calculates, which would have an impact on the residential assessment rate. So you're classifying some residential properties and shifting them to non-residential, which has an impact on the non-residential tax base, but doesn't have an impact on the target percentage, which would alleviate some of the pressure on the residential assessment rate to go down when that change is made. There's another bill to set the property tax residential assessment rate for 2019 and 2020. And then there's another policy proposal in front of the committee that would establish regional residential assessment rates. So this would be conditional on repealing the Gallagher Amendment from the Constitution. So the General Assembly would have this ability. And as it's currently drafted, and this is just a starting point, it would look at different regions across the state. The current regions that are in the bill draft are the 8 regions the Department of Local Affairs uses. And so the Division of Property Taxation would look at the residential and non-residential property in each county, in that region, in each region, and estimate what the residential assessment rate would be if those target percentages were maintained between reassessment cycles. And so you can see that there's a huge variation. So from 33.69% in the northeastern part of the state to 3.5% in the northern mountains. So because of Tabor, any increase in the residential assessment rate requires a vote of the people. And so in, say, the northeastern region, each of those counties, the voters in each of those counties would be asked, shall the residential assessment rate be increased from 7.2% or whatever it is at that point when this bill, if this bill takes effect, to 33.69%. If voters approve it, all the residential assessment rate for every county in the region and every local government within the region would increase to 33.69%. If it's a reduction, so in the northern mountains in this example to 3.5%, that just happens automatically, and the rate reduction, the residential assessment rate goes down, automatically impacting cities, counties, special districts, school districts. So again, this is a starting point. It's the regions that the Department of Local Affairs uses, and would certainly be need further discussion before the any bill actually takes effect or is moved on. And then there are 3 bills that backfill property taxes. So for districts where the residential tax basis declined by more than 5% between 2018 and 2019, the state would backfill 95% of the district's loss in the property tax revenue. So there's one backfill proposal for fire protection districts, one backfill proposal for library districts, and then a combination where it's a combined bill where it's a backfill for both fire protection districts and library districts. So those are the 7 bills. Again, they're in front of the committee. They have been drafted, but no formal position has been taken. So the final committee meeting is going to be Wednesday, October 3rd. I think it's actually at 9 o'clock, but in the state capitol. The committee will discuss these bill drafts and decide whether to move forward with them. There's a chance for amendments. If the committee does approve of them, they'll go to the Legislative Council, which is legislative leadership, and will most likely be introduced in the 2019 session. Then they become just like other bills where they have to go through the Senate and the House and be signed by the governor. There's the opportunity for amendments, but that's sort of where we are right now. So that concludes my presentation.
Joanne, we're going to invite you back in as well and turn on your camera and mic, and we'll go to the Q&A portion here. Question about the idea of a solution that would set regional residential assessment rates. Would that disparity between regions create a problem such as we might have had that led to the passage of Gallagher in the first place, disparity in assessment values between properties that are across the street from each other on a regional line?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and take that. I think there would be a disparity for local districts that cross those regional boundaries. So I'm thinking about a district like Colorado Mountain College that includes a bunch of counties in the mountains where taxpayers would be paying different amounts for the same service. So if their residential assessment rate is 50% in one district or one region and 25% in another, that would be paying, there'd be a 50% differential in the amount you're paying for those services compared to the market value of your homes. Now, I don't know how many districts there are like that where they actually cross regional boundaries, because most of them are counties. Obviously, that wouldn't cross a regional boundary. School districts, which are predominantly within counties, but it is a possibility that you'd have disparate property taxes for the same services.
Okay. And Joanne, even though we don't have your video, we have your audio. Do you have any thoughts on that about if we were to go to a regionalized assessment rate, would that recreate the problem or a problem that led to the passage of Amendment 1 back in 1982, disparity between properties? Or is...
So I think it creates its own unique problems. You have one property on one side of the street, you have another property on the other side of the street, two significantly different assessment rates. A great way to look at that is when you looked at that map that Larson shared. Adams County if you were to choose those districts, Adams County is in one district, Denver is in another. Adams County's assessment rate was 9.8. Denver's was 5.8. And so you have an issue where, which county do you live in? Right across the street. Do you live on the south side of 52nd or the north side of 52nd? It affects and it will ultimately affect your value and your taxes.
Okay. There's a question from Matt. Opinions regarding whether or not Gallagher would be working as it were intended were it not for Tabor. And let me offer a qualified limited opinion here and then invite you guys. My understanding of it is that we would still be realizing the forced decline in the residential assessment rate as long as the value of residential property was growing faster than the value of commercial property. Tabor complicates that impact by restricting special districts' ability to raise the mill levy to offset that. But Tabor is not what is driving down the assessment rate. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes.
Question here about Initiative 93, which is on the November ballot. It is a measure intended to benefit school districts, and it's somewhat complex. It would lower both the commercial and residential assessment rate as concerns school district mill levies. And there's a question of, the question specifically is what's BBCO's position on that. BBCO has no position on it. We don't take positions on measures, but I'd like to kind of reframe that and say opinions of that for our guests, Larson and Joanne. Amendment 93, do you have any opinion on what the impact of that would be? I'm not asking for you to take a position on the bill. I've just, any thoughts?
So I'm going to take that one on. I'm going to start and then Larson can correct me. First, I think it's a misnomer to say that it's a cut in the residential assessment rate. The residential assessment rate is currently at 7.2, but no one believes the residential assessment rate will be higher than 7 come January of 2019. And in 2019, it's now Amendment 73, Initiative 93 will go into effect. So, although there is a drop in the current proposal, it will never be a real drop in residential assessment rate. What you will see is a real drop in the commercial rate for all others except extracted minerals. And their rate will go from 29 to 24%. So they really will have a savings in their property tax rate. Of course, the other side of the amendment is income tax, both individual and corporate, and I'm not going to get into that too much. But the property tax side, there is going to be a freeze on both the residential and the commercial, and the freeze on residential is going to be higher than, more than likely, the actual residential assessment rate in 2019.
Okay. Any thoughts, Larson?
Yeah, I mean, I think Joanne's got it exactly right. The measure says the rates will be 7% for residential property and 24% for non-residential property for the school district property taxes. So that's the base funding. That's a mill levy overrides. Our office prepares the Blue Book, which is the voter information guide. It's nonpartisan, a balanced look at the issues. That'll be coming out in the first week of October. I think everyone should read it. It's one of the publications our office does that we're really proud of. And in that, our constitutional charge in preparing the Blue Book and the voter information guide is to provide voters with what will happen. And so we have described it as a reduction in the residential assessment rate, or an increase in the residential assessment rate from 6.11% to 7%. Because based on everything we know, the rate's going to be less than 7%. So I guess just read the Blue Book and enjoy it, and think of nonpartisan staff that slogged through it all summer.
Only somebody from the Legislative Council would say, read the Blue Book and enjoy it. We're we're at the top of the hour now. I'm gonna take 3 more questions. I'm gonna tackle one, and I'm gonna toss one to each of you. There's a question: is there an election issue this year that addresses the concerns about Gallagher? And if not, why are we having this discussion about this at this time? To my knowledge, no, there is nothing that's addressing Gallagher this year. There is Initiative 93, Amendment 93, we just talked about, that impacts Gallagher, but it doesn't address the problem that we've been talking about. The reason, correct me if I'm wrong here, Larson, the reason that we're have an interim committee addressing this now is to get ahead of the next legislative session, to prepare ideas that might be addressed in the 2019 legislative session, which may then appear on the 2019 ballot or a future ballot, potentially. So a question, Joanne, for you. If the residential assessment rate drops to 6.11, as is expected, can it adjust upward later without a vote of the people?
No. The legislature has determined not, based on that language that's in the Tabor Amendment. There had been a decision regarding coal prices and whether or not an income tax adjustment could be made. The Supreme Court determined yes, it could be, but they didn't have the burden of the specific language of Tabor talking about assessment ratios. So the legislature has always determined that that inhibits their ability to raise the assessment rate without a vote of the people.
And this gets back to, does it not, the earlier question that we addressed, Joanne, about the interplay between Tabor and Gallagher, that the Tabor is not causing the decline in the residential rate, assessment rate, but it is complicating it by not allowing it to go upward when commercial or non-residential properties rise faster than residential.
I'm going to recommend that the folks online go back to the presentation and look at those 2 slides that I had that talked about when they didn't change the residential assessment rate. During that time, the legislature chose not to go up, but by 2017, the rate was 7.2 for residential. So that has nothing to do with Tabor.
Okay, thank you. And Larson, one last question for you before we sign off. Is fiscal analysis of the 7 draft bills that are being considered, is that something that Legislative Council does before the session, or are fiscal notes calculated only if the bill is introduced formally during the session?
Yeah, so there was just a change in the last couple of years where for interim committee bills, we would do a fiscal analysis, we'll do a fiscal note. So when the committee meets on October 3rd, they will have the bill draft in front of them and they will have a fiscal analysis. Now, if that bill makes it through the process and goes and is introduced, we'll update the fiscal note then based on the December forecast, which is going to have a whole new residential assessment rate, whole new market values, and sort of be consistent and updated through the process so that members of the legislature have the very best information in front of them when they're voting yay or nay on a bill.
Okay. Thank you, both of our guests. Oh, Joanne, please chime in.
Just because I had my staff furiously research this based on a question, someone had asked how much have total Colorado property tax revenues grown? And the answer to that question is approximately an increase of 40.88%. In 2008, the property tax, total property tax state take throughout the state was a little over $6 billion, $6.3 billion. And in 2017, it was almost $9 billion, 8.9.
And the growth of that 40% is growth over what period of time?
It actually is growth over 9 years. We don't have 2018 figures yet.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you both for your joining us today and for your insights and knowledge on this important issue.